Hello, good afternoon. My name is Michelle Hawks. I'm the director for the Liu Institute for Asian Studies at the Keough School of Global Affairs. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our 5th annual Justice in Asia Distinguished Lecture. This annual event invites top scholars who examine justice in connection to Asia across disciplinary and geographical boundaries and definitions. Past speakers have come from India, from the UK, and in this country from California and from Massachusetts. So from far away. But this year, we are delighted that our keynote speaker is an esteemed scholar and university leader from here, the University of Notre Dame. Mary Gallagher, the Marilyn Keough Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs, is a top scholar of contemporary China. Political scientist, she examines Chinese domestic politics, political economy, and industrial relations. In our book called Contagious, Capitalism, she especially looks at the way in which China's economic reforms and entry into WTO change labor relations, and I think we're going to see some follow-up on that in the lecture today. She earned a PhD from Princeton University, BA in Government and East Asian Studies from Smith College, international experience including a period at the Foreign Affairs College in Beijing, as well as time spent in Japan. She has received multiple honors for her research, including 2 Fulbright Awards and grants from the National Science Foundation and the Luce Foundation. She's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, a consultant for the World Bank, and has been a consultant for the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Department of Labor, among many other organizations. She joined Notre Dame this fall from the University of Michigan, is now an ardent Notre Dame football fan, and has already earned a reputation as a wise, compassionate, and transparent administrator. We are fortunate to have this time to learn from her in her area of expertise. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dean Mary Gallagher.
Thank you, Michelle. So as the dean and as the steward of all of our resources, I'm really glad that you invited me and don't need to pay me an honorarium.
Is that a hint?
No, I don't think I would permit an honorarium to myself, particularly. But no, seriously, thank you very much. I'm really honored to give this lecture on justice in Asia. And like I said this morning or this afternoon when I had lunch with some of the students and faculty who are involved in the project, it was very strange to write this talk because first I didn't have much time because I accepted it at the beginning of my deanship and then realized I had no time to do much of anything. But also because I think you proposed, Michelle, that I talk about contagious capitalism. And so it ended up being an overview for myself of my work and seeing how even the 2 first projects I'll talk about are very closely connected intellectually, but even the thing I'm working on now is, I think, more than I realized connected to my earlier work with this interest in Chinese labor and labor in general under globalization. I know I don't have a lot of time because we're supposed to end at 5:30, so I will go through some slides. I think as I see that maybe it's not too necessary to go into detail about some of the arguments that I make. But what I'm hoping to do is to talk a little bit about contagious capitalism, which was my dissertation at Princeton University, where I got my PhD, and my first book. It was published in 2005. Authoritarian Legality, which was my second book, published in 2017. I did write some other things between those 2, so don't worry. I know for people who are assistant professors, the second book is very difficult because you have a real life. Not that grad students don't have real lives, they just have easier lives. Even though you think they're really difficult right now, they're not actually as difficult as it might get. Then I want to talk briefly about something I presented in the fall, which is about the United States and views towards China here right now. Also talking a little bit about a comparison with Germany. And then I'll conclude with some comparisons to the current moment. So contagious capitalism to contagious authoritarianism. The argument that I made in Contagious Capitalism is in the context of the period when I was in grad school in the 1990s to, I finished in 2000, when the Cold War had finished and there was this remarkable decade of reform in not just China, but in many parts of Europe and in Russia. The argument that I make in this book is correct. Let me just say that. Because I went back to the Princeton U Press website to get the cover, and I noticed the blurb said, many people believed that economic liberalization in China would lead to democratization. And in this book, I was like, oh my God, I need to make sure that the next time an American official says everybody thought that engagement with China was going to lead to democratization and you're all wrong and you were all soft on China and now it's a disaster, I can say, please go to the Princeton University Press and look at my book. Because what I argued, and actually I think many people were seeing in China at the time, is that China had certain differences with other socialist countries that made its reform path different. And so Contagious Capitalism talks about the sequencing of the reforms and also the timing of reforms. And this is looking at workplaces, including state companies, as well as the expansion of these new sectors in the private and the foreign sectors. So the basic argument is that China went through these very difficult socialist reforms of socialism, like all socialist countries did, but it did it really late. It did it about 20 years into the reform period, so at the end of the 1990s. And it did it in a sequence where Barry Naughton, who's an economist, has a great book called Growing Out of the Plan. And so in a sense, you have the market sort of grow up and become really strong as the plan sort of was alongside of it. And the plan eventually diminished and was sort of outcompeted because the markets were allowed to develop first. And so foreign companies coming in the 80s and the 90s and really into the 2000s in a big way were able to supply important parts of China's economic growth story. So they provided a regulatory framework, they provided capitalist HR skills, they taught socialist companies how to discipline workers, and they basically, this idea of contagious capitalism, they inserted capitalism into a socialist country, but gradually over time. This was, it sounds very shocking, of course, but remember, it happened gradually. And as I'll talk about in some other slides, it happened to parts of the workforce that most people didn't really care about. So it happened first and foremost and most excruciatingly to migrant workers, so rural workers in China who had migrated to work in these new factories. The book also argues some other things around the ideology and the competition. So the argument about competition is that this insertion of foreign companies into a country that was coming out of a pretty radical experiment with Maoist communism started to change the debate over China losing socialism or China moving away from communism to one that was starting to center a much more nationalistic competition with the rest of the world. And that also, I think, remember that it was gradual and that happened over time, and Maoism at the very end was a huge failure. And this allowed, I think, the regime to make some pretty dramatic and radical shifts in its companies, but to frame it as this is something that we need to do in order to compete with foreign companies. And I think, we talk a lot now about nationalism sort of replacing socialism or communism in China as an ideology, but this is a long time ago, right? This started a long time ago, much more in the economy than in the political side. Okay, so that's, there's some other things on the slide, but I'll So then a few, as I was finishing the book, actually, the book was, the research was done, but one of the articles that I published not long after I started teaching was framing this around this question of democratization. And the title is something, I couldn't even remember the title. I didn't look it up. I can't bear to read my own work right now. But the argument it makes is that this reframing of the economic challenges that China was going through in the 1980s and the 1990s that really were putting, as I'll talk about later, direct assaults on workers, right? Like the ways in which state-owned enterprise workers were being laid off en masse at the end of the 1990s. Really shocking things. And in most cases, what we saw in other countries, this type of reform was extremely difficult. But again, talking about the sequencing and the timing in terms of how China did it, that this allowed the regime to survive and allowed the regime to push back this question of democratization way down the line. And in fact, of course, what we see now is, in some ways, it's possible that China has sort of gotten through this period. And the ways in which China may or may not ever change politically might not have that much to do with the transition from socialism to what its economy is now, which I would call state capitalism, right? Where you have a lot of markets, you have a lot of the use of markets, the ways in which people are employed is very capitalistic, but the economy is still overwhelmingly directed and in large part owned by the party. So this argument about delayed democratization, again, focused on the reform sequencing, and other aspects of China's reform success that I think are not only made it economically successful, but also made it politically successful for the Chinese Communist Party. So decentralized authoritarianism is a term that was developed, it's used by Pierre Landry, but it was also used by an economist in Hong Kong to describe how China was able to leverage the competition between regions as a way to move the economy and grow rapidly. And some kind of competition is really important to all of the East Asian growth models, even if the economies were much more closed than China. So comparing China to, say, South Korea and Japan, they did not allow foreign direct investment in the same way that China did, but they used the export markets as a way to foster competition, right? And Alice Amson has this great book about Korea that describes this use of exports as a way to sort of discipline firms, for firms to become economically competitive globally, even though the economy is really quite closed. China, of course, became very open to foreign direct investment, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, as a way to adopt these capitalistic practices. And then it got the competition from regions. And so the regions, and there's a lot, the ways in which local officials in China competed for office was by demonstrating that they could grow their own local economy. Again, related to how the kind of the political installation of this reform strategy, not only was the sequencing done in such a way that it was very late, but like I said, migrant workers being on the front lines of China's sort of export powerhouse also means that urban workers were relatively protected from the way in which capitalistic reforms were put into the workplace. Not completely, and I don't want to overestimate that, but just in terms of the intensity of China becoming a manufacturing powerhouse, the labor conditions that were put into place for China to become so competitive were really heavily concentrated in firms that employed migrant workers as production workers. So I think it's. I'll come back to this when I talk about Xi Jinping at the end. China's a communist country. It's ruled by a communist party, but there are important aspects of the Chinese economy that I would call neoliberal, that I would call heavily reliant on discipline, on competition, and on individual risk. Now, that was done in such a way, as I argue in the book and in this piece, was done in such a way to justify moving away from socialism because of the need to compete, justify putting, say, Social Security onto the individual worker, or in some cases, no Social Security, breaking down what they called the Iron Rice Bowl, basically smashing the Iron Rice Bowl, which was this socialist guarantee of security and of lifetime employment. All of these things were broken down and removed in the context of China becoming competitive globally. And so, like I said in the last slide too, reorienting the argument about competition, moving away from is socialism better or is capitalism better, but really focusing on what does China need to do to be successful. Okay, fast forward, writing this book took a long time. It was really hard to decide when to stop writing this book because there was so much going on. And as you'll see, if I could go on and on about this time period, and I have a lot more slides about this book than Contagious Capitalism, partly because the fieldwork was so exciting and so interesting, but it was very hard to figure out when I should end, because it seems like things were changing so rapidly and anything could happen. Until people I was working with started to get arrested, right? Until I saw activists getting arrested, I saw legal aid centers that I had worked at getting closed down. I just saw a complete reorientation of what was happening. And this was right around 2014. So then I had finished the book and moved on to study the United States. So if we fast forward from this period in the 80s and 90s where China is absolutely booming, it's becoming the workshop of the world, there's all these export processing zones all around the country. Lots of investment is going into China to take advantage of very low-cost labor and very lax regulation, so very bad working conditions in many factories. To this period in, you could date it a lot. You could date it from '95 when the first law is passed. If we want to talk about social movements, I would say really starting around 2008, when after the financial crisis, when there's a lot of money swishing through China. But what happens is that the success of this earlier period that I was studying is almost too successful. China is absolutely booming. It's changing every single year. Cities are being rebuilt. Subway systems, like Shanghai didn't have a subway system when I first went there. It's now got probably second after Tokyo in Asia. So it's a time of enormous growth and success, but it was also incredibly destabilizing. Because of the layoffs that I alluded to at the very end of the 90s, when the sequencing it's finally now time to really change the state sector, right? The state sector is going to not remain competitive if it continues to operate like socialist firms. So there's massive layoffs at the end of the 1990s in the state sector. 30 million people are laid off in 4 years. And that doesn't even capture the amount of devastation that happens in terms of what people's employment becomes. Much more precarious, much more like the migrant workers that they had been seeing alongside. So you have this boom in export processing zones with migrants. You have the state-owned enterprises being completely restructured, mass layoffs, and you have a lot of conflict. And what the government does, which was super interesting to me to study as a social scientist, is the government starts to pass a lot of new laws, guaranteeing employment security, guaranteeing minimum wage, guaranteeing a social welfare system, and putting these laws into place by the central government, often very kind of abstract laws. China's legal system kind of works that way. Abstract laws at the top, and then the local governments fill in with regulations and enforcement. Now, what the book called this authoritarian legality, there's lots of different terms. So some people like rule by law. Some people like legal authoritarianism. Susan Whiting has a book coming out that I think is illiberal something. So what we're trying to capture, I think all of us working in this space, is this idea that the Chinese government at the time, not anymore, was attempting to develop a system of good governance that didn't mean becoming democratic, right? So sort of trying to find substitutes for democratization. And in a kind of good faith way, trying to provide better institutions to manage this immense social transformation that China was going through. And so in the case of the workplace, what happens is that the central state starts to give out all of these laws, right? These are rights that are given to people by the state, right? In an authoritarian system, it's not that there's like a legislative, a bottom-up, pressure from lawmakers. It's that the state is deciding these are the rights we're going to give workers. Because China is a very decentralized country, it then goes to the local governments, provincial and lower, to enforce the laws and to implement them. And then in terms of who uses the laws are really set up for individual workers to press their case in court or in arbitration. So it's a very individualized system. It's a system that doesn't have powerful trade unions, that doesn't have big class action lawsuits, that really made it very difficult for there to be collective protests and strikes, although they did happen, of course. It's a way to sort of empower people using the legal system, but making it very difficult to use. Right? So there are rights, and the rights are on paper, but very difficult to use because they're so individualized. So I'll talk about that later. They're market conforming and politically constrained. They're hard to actually operationalize. Partly because of this problem of the laws being hard to actually use in practice, and most of my research was talking to workers and doing surveys to figure out, like, did they ever work, and if they worked, why, and what did people think about when they failed, at a legal aid center in Shanghai. I'd seen just how difficult it was for people. And the media actually covered this because the media in China was quite free at the time, so there's also a lot of media coverage of why these things were hard to actually use in practice. Subsequent, and this is sort of the second half of the project, I was really focused on this kind of individualized legal mobilization. What I started to see around me, including at the Legal Aid Center, is like the rise of a nascent social movement. Lawyers, activists, former workers, sometimes students, sometimes people from within the Chinese party, within the Communist Party, who sympathized, who were more liberal or progressively minded. So you saw these social movements coming together around labor conditions. You probably also saw in the United States at the same time from the outside, right? People who are anti-sweatshops, right? Students on campuses who are trying to organize. There was a lot of activity at Michigan on branded wear. And in fact, Notre Dame is one of the few universities that doesn't produce in China because of decisions made at this time period, which is actually hypocritical because they do produce in Vietnam. So I mean, I gave them feedback when I arrived. I was like, that's nice, but you should probably just produce in good factories, no matter where they are. And there are now good factories in China, I would argue. But so what we saw in the second half was this kind of social movement in formation, and we also saw other social movements of feminists, environmental activists, land, property, students. So it was a really exciting time to study these social movements. And so I thought about making this talk about democratization and liberalization and why. I argued in 2003 that it was delayed, and I was like, yeah, it's delayed. Did it have to be this delayed? Like, I mein, it's 2025. I was hoping there'd be some change before that, but no. So, okay, I'm gonna have to go faster, I've decided, because otherwise I'll never get to the other parts. I'm gonna skip through. These are just things that are helpful to know in terms of, and I think they're less known. If you look at China's labor standards, its laws and regulations around employment, it has some of the highest standards in the world, including for things like social insurance contributions. And if you looked at statistics on like participation in social insurance schemes, China's participation is very, very high. Although it's very uneven because there are two different systems for rural people and urban people. At the same time that these laws were being passed, the party was also doing something called legal dissemination campaigns, where it used the media is state-controlled, to make sure that people knew about the awareness of their rights. And I have funny props I used to carry around. There was a deck of cards so that migrant workers would play cards. There was a deck of cards where each card had a labor rule on it. So you could play cards after work and also learn about your legal rights at the same time. But like I said, delegated to workers to do individually without much help collectively. The book tries to argue for why this would be the case, why China as an authoritarian regime would be empowering people. And the argument is in the context of the things that this government, which was Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, they were the last leaders before Xi Jinping, what was motivating them to provide these new rights? It's unusual for an authoritarian regime to be providing rights and to being putting pressure on itself to help people realize these rights. And again, this is a very specific time in China when I think there was a lot of optimism about where China was going and how China would become a rich country. And because it had developed so rapidly in the 80s and 90s, through this bifurcated labor scheme where you had migrant workers from rural China who had no social security whatsoever. No social security whatsoever. So if they got injured or as they got older, they had nothing to rely on except for their families. They would go back to the countryside and live off the land, or their children, if their children were then earning money. And so a lot of what the regime at the time, which was, I didn't think at the time, more progressive than the one we have now, it was a way in which to think about this is how China gets to a new level of development. It's going to become reliant on domestic demand. It's going to become a consumer society, not just a manufacturing powerhouse. And to do that, we need to address inequality. So a lot of the labor laws and the Social Security laws that came into place at the time were there to move China in this direction. So it was called New Style Urbanization, land security, which you got as a rural person. You exchange it by going to the city. You get hired. You get an employment contract. You start to pay into Social Security. And there were very good reasons for the government to want to do this, because we all know at the time, or we started to realize right around this period of time when there started to be labor shortages, that China was aging really, really rapidly, and it was aging more rapidly than anyone had expected. So the one-child policy was put into place in the 70s, at the end of the 70s. But for other reasons, as China got richer, people just started to have fewer children, and families got smaller, and because health and medical care improved, people started to live longer. So there's also this self-interest from the government, is that, oh my God, we need to get these rural workers who are very young paying into this system. How else is the system going to be sustainable? So we need to develop a framework where we offer more security, we offer formal employment, people move into the cities, and this is how China kind of shifts from where it was, and it was very successful, to a kind of a new style economy, which is more consumer-led, more services than manufacturing. So I really want to emphasize that this kind of model, and I don't see the expansion of labor rights in China as something that the regime was doing out of altruism. It was doing it out of a concern for its development model, that it was something that it needed to do in order to address these other larger concerns about its economic model, about low consumption, and about the lack of security for so many people in the countryside, which then made it difficult for their social security to be sustainable. So to think about this not as something that the government was doing as a move towards more progressive politics, but rather it was moving towards a higher model of economic development. And so the book talks about the how as well. And again, this goes back to this legal mobilization, but very politically constrained. So market conforming means that the people who are best able, and the book argues this in relation to how people use the legal system, The people who are most adept at using the legal system, like in most countries, are people with higher education and in formal firms and in urban areas. So it basically like reinforced the inequality that China already had. So you have the gap between high standards, it's publicized by the state, and this legal mobilization substitutes for the state's own enforcement. That also makes it such that social unrest around, this is theoretically because it doesn't end up working like this, social unrest around legal rights will be more constrained because the people who are using those rights are themselves more privileged. And so the model itself is built on a certain amount of reinforcing the inequalities that China had already built into its economic model. Okay, so I'm looking at the clock, and there's like some theory slides which I'm going to skip over because we can get rid of theory for now. I want to just mention this one in particular, this notion of hierarchical trust, which is something we talk a lot about in Chinese politics. If people do, and this is not just about Xi Jinping being more authoritarian, but if we look at public opinion and trust in the government in China, it is the reverse of the United States. People have very high levels of trust in the central government and very low levels of trust in the local government. So we use this term hierarchical trust to describe this phenomenon, which is, I think, more unusual in democracies. Another reason for why this model works to the central government's benefit is that it is the central law that grants these rights to people, and it is the local governments that get blamed for the lack of enforcement and for implementation of the rules themselves. So it reinforces, again, another thing that the central government really benefits from, which is a sense that the central government really wants good and is doing these things in good faith, but it is the bad local governments that are corrupt, that are ruining this model. Okay, so too many slides. I think I've talked about this already in terms of this type of individualized legal mobilization really being very politically constrained in the sense that trade unions, free trade unions are not legal in China. The ways in which I could go into a lot of detail about how when workers would try to put forward a collective suit with all the same reasons, it would not be accepted, that the judges and the arbitration committees would break things down to keep people individualized. This is not unusual. The United States also has a lot of rules in labor cases that also make this similar. And I think this is another way in which China's political economy, even though it is ruled by a communist party, is still very much in line with what we would see in other more market-based systems. Okay, so I'm going to try to move ahead. I just have one more thing about this time period. And this goes to the second half of the time frame where I talked also not just about individualized legal mobilization, but the fact that it often failed, right? That it was very difficult, particularly for people who really wanted and needed the legal system to work. So migrant workers who are not being paid their wages for months on end, people with occupational disease, right, and needing compensation or occupational injury, or having been promised social insurance for years and never getting it. There are lots of different cases like that. So the fantasy that the government had about passing laws, protective laws, and allowing for some degree of enforcement and implementation of those laws did not lead to what they expected. It led instead to massive social unrest. At the height of this time period, it's a little bit hard to tell because they stopped releasing statistics about it in 2010. There were thousands of mass incidents every day in China. Not all labor. Sometimes they were land. Sometimes they were about environmental protection. I remember this time period really. I'm sure you do too, Michelle. How how much it seemed that the civil society in China was really alive with this notion of rights and this notion of social change through rights claiming. And social movements and strikes like the one that's pictured here were a daily occurrence. So this is something that Ben Liebman, who's at Columbia's law school, calls the law stability paradox. So the more laws that the government passed, in fact, there was more and more instability because the laws weren't well enforced, because they were difficult to use, but they gave people a lot of hope. I think this is the last, yeah. So this is a great data source, China Labor Bulletin, which somehow is still based in Hong Kong, I think, provides this data of where strikes are happening. Might have moved out of Hong Kong, actually. Victoria, you might know. I don't know. And these are some of my favorite strikes. So the one on the left is a famous picture. It's from a strike in the automotive, in Honda's factories, mostly Honda's factories, in 2010. This is a famous picture because the people wearing the yellow hats are from the local trade union. And they were sent to the Honda factory to suppress the workers who were striking for higher wages. This strike had a massive impact on the labor movement in China. I argued that it was partly because it was in a Japanese company. It went really, really far. The entire Honda supply chain was shut down for several weeks. And the premier at the time, Wen Jiabao, said in a press conference that Chinese workers' wages should go up, right? Sending, I think, a signal that this strike is justified. And then there were lots of other examples at the same time of using, and this is when social media is just beginning in China, of using things like, these are workers on the other side doing a dance, Gangnam Style, to bring publicity to the fact that they haven't been paid their wages. So it's hard to believe that this was all happening just as Xi Jinping is coming into office at around 2013, 2012. One of the largest strikes in 2014 was in southern China in Guangdong province. Over 40,000 migrant workers took to the streets to get social insurance benefits. And then the other picture is a crackdown in 2014, which basically ends this time period taken in Hong Kong, where there were still a lot of labor activists living and working before the crackdown on Hong Kong 5 years later. So that ends. I write the book because it ended. Although I'm not sure I knew that it was going to end and never come back, but it ended gradually and then very clearly from 2014 until the end of Xi Jinping's first term in 2018, when he got rid of term limits for president and is now in his third term, unprecedented third term. So you saw the repression of social movements and activists. He came down very hard, but he also, I think, really fundamentally changed the way the government addressed the problem of labor unrest. He adopted what he calls the Feng Chao model, which is a model from Zhejiang province, which is much more about mediation and local resolution. Arrested, like I said, social labor activists, but also importantly ended the legislative activism that the government itself had done. So stopped passing new laws, amended a lot of laws to reduce rights, and then also ended the aim to make China's development model move towards consumption, move towards demand, domestic demand, move towards less reliance on exports and on manufacturing. And he begins this shift. It's really going back to the old model before COVID, and then you see it come back right now in a much more extreme way. So Xi Jinping, for a lot of other reasons, which I'm not going to talk about because I haven't written about it yet, I think, as with the political side, really does have a different view of China's future. Previously, all of the other leaders of the Communist Party, in talking about China's political future, would say as good Marxists, that China is not ready for democracy, right? Democracy needs, rich countries can benefit from democracies. Rich countries can have democracy. China's just not ready. China's still in the primary stage of capital accumulation, right? That's the Marxist term for where China is. Xi Jinping does not say that. Xi Jinping says China is not suited to democracy. China should never become democratic. And in a way, I think what he's articulating now on the economy, too, is that China's economy can stay in this manufacturing, high levels of investment for a very long time. And it should do that to make China wealthy and strong and autonomous from the United States. So there's other things that have made that more important now with the ways in which the US-China relationship has changed. Okay, I am don't need to show charts, blah, 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 okay, because so Xi Jinping comes in, he talks about common prosperity. I've written a lot about what his conception of common prosperity is. It's a little bit what I was just talking about. It's really important when people focus on common prosperity. This is his term for where China should be. He talks about China as needing an olive-shaped society. By olive-shaped society, he means not a lot of rich people, not a lot of poor people, lots of people in the middle. So it sounds great. It sounds like social democracy. He's not just done this very dramatic and successful crackdown on labor, he has also done a very successful crackdown on private capital, particularly in 2021 when there was this common prosperity campaign. The redistributive reforms that I talked about, the social insurance expansion, the ways in which people would migrate and get urban residency, all of those things have slowed way, way down. And he's reverted China's development model away from consumption back to manufacturing. And part of the reason why you see a lot of trade friction between the United States and China is that China has become much less reliant on consumption and domestic demand is way down, and rather it's going to focus on exports, which is one of the reasons, not the only, that you see conflict. And in this campaign in 2021, when he was articulating common prosperity, lots of people thought that meant, okay, Xi Jinping is actually going to continue with these redistributive reforms. He's going to expand the social insurance and social welfare state so that China can move towards a more consumption-based model. He very clearly said, no, if we become like Europe, we will become a welfare state with a bunch of lazy people. I mean, he basically said that. So again, another way in which right-wing parties in capitalist economies and a communist leader in China can sound very similar, right, in terms of their outlook on what the economy should look like and what redistribution should look like. So fast forward right now, I'm studying the United States and its attitudes towards China. Yeah, so this is my favorite quote of Donald Trump's, only 2023. Think of President Xi, Mr. Trump told the crowd, central casting, brilliant guy. You know, when I say he's brilliant, everyone says, oh, that's terrible. Well, he runs 1.4 billion people with an iron fist, smart, brilliant, everything perfect. So how does this connect? I've been wondering, as I was preparing this talk, I was thinking, oh, there's so many interesting things that are happening right now, because my first book was about contagious capitalism. It was about China using foreign investment to adopt practices it saw as really beneficial and needed for China to transform its economy. Now what you see in the United States is, I think, a real admiration for aspects of China's authoritarianism. So the thing I'm working on now is a comparison between the United States and Germany, where we find that there are lots of people in both countries who will talk about China in very negative terms, that China is a threat, but the words they use to describe China are often complimentary. China is strong, China is unified. The term from one of the German interviews with my German colleague, who is a German speaker, was fascist turbo capitalism, sometimes talking about the work ethic. And interestingly, in both of the countries, talking about China almost as a mirror to the mistakes or the problems they see in their own society. So bureaucracy in Germany, that Germany used to be efficient and it's no longer efficient. And in the United States, polarization, right? China is unified. China has a strong leader. They can all row together, people would talk about. So I think that's one of the reasons why now, when we think about the moment we're in right now, where there's huge risk of conflict between the United States and China, and huge fear about what will happen to the global economy as the United States retracts. And we see that there are a lot of similarities to the United States and China. The things that I'm just talking about now in terms of policies are not just about the Trump administration. So the Trump administration has talked about patriotic education. That is directly taken from the Communist Party in China in the 1990s as a way to make students more appreciative of the party. But Biden's administration doubled down on industrial policy and really looked at how did China build up these industries and become so successful, and what do we need to do to compete with China? Other things like the politicization of the judiciary as well, which in China has always been the case. I don't think it's a coincidence that we see in both countries strongman leaders, right? At a moment of uncertainty, at a moment of a lot of inequality, and strongman leaders who both use economic nationalism to attempt to sort of unify the population against the other. So, gosh, that was a lot. I told you my whole life story as a China specialist in 40 minutes or so. And I went through some of the slides quickly, so I probably need to explain some more of the argument. But I'm going to stop there so we have a few minutes for questions. Thank you.
Do you want to take questions one at a time, or do you want to take
I can take, I don't know, I'll take one at a time or more. Victoria?
Yeah, China Labour Bulletin is still in Hong Kong, the Han Dong File is still in Hong Kong. But it just occurred to me that in 4 years, the party fired 30 million people.
Yeah.
And so that, because it was not a democracy, and therefore they could do all of that. But then at the same time, if you have a democracy, we still wind up with basically a very strong leader. So I just wonder, ultimately, do all of those stories in China and the United States essentially converge because of economic nationalism?
I think we tend to think about when this time period, and so I'll go back to the slide which I didn't talk about. When we think about this time period, let's say 1980, which is right around the time China begins its reforms, 1978-9, and 2018, which is when the first trade war starts. There were other conflicts, but obviously things happened between that. But I think it's really important when we think about this time period, we think about China did all this economic reform. China was amazingly successful. And then we forget that China also went through enormous transformation, and for that time period when 30 million people were laid off at the end of the 1990s, incredible economic disruption. And then of course we think about the United States. So the United States, it's a little bit later, it's in the 90s and in the early 2000s, we talk about the China shock, right? The shock of competing with China after China enters WTO, huge amount of job losses in concentrated parts of the United States, including the upper Midwest. China is not only responsible for that. We can think about automation, we can think about movements prior to other parts of Asia, right? So Korea, Taiwan, all those places that got investment from the United States as production moved. But when I think about this time period, I think about the incredible economic disruption that both countries went through. And then I think about other things that we have in common. We both have weak and uneven welfare states. We both rely on migration for growth and employment. If we think about China, what are the jobs that migrant workers are in? and we think about the United States, what are the jobs that illegal immigrants are in? It is the same kinds of jobs. It's the jobs that nobody else wants to do. So we have that cleavage, right? And that also creates enormous conflict in both countries, right? In the United States, the argument about the conflict about immigration is really one of the reasons why we see why Donald Trump won the election in 2024. In China, it's hidden now because there's so few people covering China who are international journalists, and there's a huge amount of censorship. But in China, I would argue one of the biggest social issues now is the division of scarce resources in China between migrants and people who are in urban areas. For education, for real estate, for all these, for social insurance. So there's all these ways in which we have that similarity as well. We have this conflict over distribution and migration. And we also tolerate huge amounts of inequality. We're both highly unequal societies. So I guess in terms of why did we get here, right? The story is sort of linked in a way that I hadn't really been thinking about. And I think at times of economic disruption, of high levels of inequality, particularly when the welfare state is weak, and there's a lot of disruption, pandemic, I think people do look for strongmen, right? They do look for leaders that are going to do something, right, and take large action. And Xi Jinping has done that, and Donald Trump has done that as well. Also, another sort of similarity, which I think is quite dangerous, is that they are both, Biden was like this too though, both believe very, very strongly in this idea of manufacturing. We have to maintain a manufacturing core, and for Trump, it's really like we have to bring that back. Xi Jinping thinks the same thing. Okay, right there, and then in the back.
Thank you so much for the lecture. And you mentioned this bootstrapped common prosperity idea. I think this is very much true. And I'm just wondering, like, facing this current economic recession and technology reforms in China, would Xi kind of change his policies? For example, like facing Trump's tariffs, maybe the Chinese government will emphasize more on this like consumption market, and maybe they will also like make more like redistributive reform actions. Right.
Yes, that is. I was just talking about this at something else, that it might be the silver lining for what Trump is with the 107% tariffs that we now have. That it may be really an impetus for significant reform. Xi Jinping has not done a lot of reform, I have to say. I mean, he's done a lot of things. He has not done many things that he talked about in 2013 alongside these types of reforms. It will take a significant amount of change for China to do that, including probably selling off parts of the state-owned industry in order to provide more resources to the private sector and to households. I don't know if that will happen, but certainly, and we think about, this was a term in the 1980s when the United States and Japan were in not as severe, but also pretty significant economic nationalism and conflict, this idea of gaetsu, that Japan would use foreign pressure as a way to change its domestic model. So,
thank you.
In the back, yeah.
How does its military strategy fit into what story you just told? Is it primarily a defensive strategy? Is it an offensive strategy? And if it's offensive, is it control, or is it to assure its access to products and things that it needs for manufacturing?
China's military expansion has been very significant in the last 20 years. Some of it is it's purely about Taiwan. So part of it is ensuring that China has the capacity to take Taiwan militarily. Whether or not they will do that once they're ready, I think, is a big question. The fact that Russia has had so much trouble with Ukraine means that I think they're maybe more hesitant to do it. I think in this case, it does really matter what the United States does and what the United States says. And Trump has been, as he is with many things, unclear about what it would mean to defend Taiwan and would the United States be there. But a lot of the military buildup in the South China Sea and around the island of Taiwan has been to ensure that China can take it. It's also done a huge amount of nuclear buildup. And again, learning lessons from what's happened with Russia as well as with other countries that have become nuclear powers, that there's a really good reason for China to be more competitive with nuclear missiles and including ICBMs, that deterrence can be really important. And then more broadly, I guess, so my answer is yes to everything that you said. The other ways in which we see China's military expansion is to ensure that it has access to resources that it needs, so building ports and highways and infrastructure in parts of Asia and Africa, where it's particularly reliant on things like cobalt and copper for inputs into manufacturing back in China.
One more short question.
Okay. So one here, and then Anibal is in the back. Yeah, go ahead.
I was sort of curious, like in the U.S., like the sort of like move to a consumer sort of base has kind of led to a decline in sort of labor rights. That's sort of how I might be wrong.
Yeah.
But I was just curious about why in sort of like China used Kazakh sort of like almost a reverse where they like try, to increase their labor rights as compared to the U.S. doing like having the opposite.
I think that the reason why, if I understood your question, the reason why service, so for China, the lack of labor rights doesn't matter if they're in manufacturing or in services. I think there are differences in services. For example, people change jobs. White collar workers are harder to organize. But the reason why it doesn't really matter is that in manufacturing as well, China's system of unions, it does have unions, is that the unions are controlled by the party. And so the unions don't function as they do in the United States, where the argument for the United States is that the reason why there was more power for workers in a system based on manufacturing is that unions were in the manufacturing sector. So the highest, I think at the height, we had something like 35% of the workforce in the United States was unionized. Now we have the opposite, where most manufacturing workers aren't unionized, but we have like teachers unions and public sector unions. And so that's why in the US service sectors, you could still have labor rights there. But sorry, that was more about the United States anyway. But for China, it didn't really matter because unions were not a thing in manufacturing. Last question for Anibal. Go ahead.
So, quick question. Thanks for the talk. It was super interesting. I was really curious about how this huge historical transformation that you described played into the factional politics of the party, because what you described is a huge social process of transformation with people moving to the cities, not having complete rights, right? That social conflict. And I could imagine that for the politics within the party, that probably meant that there were more populist factions
Yes.
and to mobilize those sectors. So how did it play out?
So the most interesting thing that happened at the very end of this time period was right before Xi Jinping came into power with Bo Xilai. So Bo Xilai was the mayor of Chongqing. He led one of the other factions, although in a sense, Xi Jinping and Bo Xilai are both princelings. They're both the sons of very famous Communist Party leaders from the revolution. But Bo Xilai was a populist. Xi Jinping was known as a more kind of, not a reformist, but someone who was much more orthodox. And in 2011, 2012, Bo Xilai essentially launched a coup after he was not going to get the general secretary. So that was the last time that you saw this kind of policy debate play out in factions. I do have a paper that shows that all of Xi Jinping's language on common prosperity, not the actual policies, but the language, is totally copied from Bo Xilai in Chongqing, who used the term common prosperity not first, it's really from Deng Xiaoping, but used it in this populist drive in Chongqing, and was very much about social welfare and redistribution, hukou reform. I mean, he's now in prison, but that's how it played out at the very end, is that there was this attempt to go up against him, and the party really came down hard. his wife also killed a British businessman, so that was kind of, that made it more difficult once that happened. But that's a great story. If you don't know that story, I recommend reading about it. Thank you.
So before we all disperse then towards the reception outside, there's one small thing we have to take care of. You mentioned the honorarium, which we're not allowed to give, but we do want to present you with a gift basket of local South Bend products put together by a company called Take Care, which is an Asian-owned business here in
Wow,
South Bend.
thank you. Wow, that's great.